Thank you, Andy. It's a delight to be here today, obviously. And I just want to start with a few words about the text, and then we'll begin this conversation. So, out of all the books that we teach at Purdue's Cornerstone program through our transformative text sequence, Shelley's Frankenstein is without a doubt the most often required 19th century novel. Its virtues are many, including its length. It is relatively short, and its four-part epistolary structure makes it easy to divide and assign. Its shifting narratives also allow us to see the story unfold from different perspectives. Its themes, which are many and which continue to be pulled out and analyzed by scholars, allow us to challenge students to think through enduring problems, both in their own lives and in the world around them. Now, I know that we often think about this novel as a cautionary tale about man playing God or perverting nature, or even as a prophetic warning against man-made life forms. And I think it does help us think about the ethics of scientific research and discovery, which is something I'm going to ask Deborah about momentarily. But I think we can also agree that this text is also more than that. It's richly textured, and it can speak to issues of education, the environment, justice and power relations, women and gender, and to my mind, what it means to be a whole human being, educated and well-read. I bet we can all agree on that. But also to be surrounded by loved ones and having a community and companionship, those things that Victor forsakes and the creature desperately seeks. Now, Deborah and I have decided to lead this workshop as a sort of interview and conversation, as Andy suggested. I shall play the role of provocateur, something I'm very familiar with here at Purdue. And Deborah will play the role that she's most familiar with, expert teacher and scholar of 19th century literature and culture. So Deborah, let us begin with the central problematic character, the university student, Victor Frankenstein. And the obvious question, of course, is can students identify with him? After all, many of them are interested in creating artificial life. This is particularly true here at Purdue. They want to change the world. They want to become the next Elon Musk. And the related question, if you don't mind a two-part question, is can this text actually help students think through ethical questions at the heart of scientific research? Does it challenge their thinking about the goals of research and discovery?
First, a thank you to Andy for inviting me to do this, and to Melinda for being my partner in crime here. And she has a lot to say as well about the novel, so she will also be a teacher scholar today. One thing I'd like to say is that Mary Shelley was extremely knowledgeable about some of the scientific experiments and inquiry of her time. Things like electricity, mesmerism, which we don't think of as a science, but which was kind of a pseudoscience, and galvanism, which was a way of experimenting with electricity to, for instance, animate the legs of frogs, right? So that sense that you actually could bring something to life that was dead matter. So she was thinking a lot about science with a great deal of knowledge. She gave the subtitle to her novel, The Modern Prometheus, which I think is very much relevant to your question, Melinda. Prometheus, who, as I'm sure many of you know, was a mythical character, a titan, not quite a god, but a step below a god, who had stolen the secret of fire from the gods to give to humankind. And I think one of the reasons Prometheus is such an interesting choice is that he was both transgressive and punished for what he did, badly punished, but he also gave a gift, right, to mankind. So I think in that you have, to some degree, and I'm working my way, I think, to the answer here, to a kind of ambivalence or perhaps questioning. And I think at best we can think of this novel as a way of proposing questions about just the problems that Melinda underscored. That is, what is the extent of human experimentation that will bear a kind of ethical scrutiny. How do you balance the ethics of scientific experimentation or technological advance in our own age with the values of human community, with the needs of human beings, with the safety of the environment? How many sort of changes do we want to ring on nature, which is such an important topic in the novel, which I think we might get to. So I think more than anything, she was thinking about perhaps an unreachable balance, but a balance between the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake and the responsibility that all human beings, including scholars and researchers, have to their families, to their loved ones, to the environment, and to the human community. So I think the novel as a fiction gives us a chance to contemplate these answers. And fictions are not dogma. They don't have, rigid answers. They ask questions, which is one of the things that's great about teaching novels. The issue of what it is that she's critiquing here, I think she's critiquing egotism, which she knew a lot about because she was surrounded by a kind of coterie of very egotistical young men, poets, intellectuals, revolutionaries, and excessive individualism. That is this focus on the self and the ambitions of the self, as opposed to the needs of the community. It's interesting to remember that Victor Frankenstein is not only someone who wants to experiment, he says he wants to create a new species, right? Which is a rather hubristic ambition. And he says that when he creates this new species, they will be grateful to him. So there is an element of egotism here that I think goes beyond just a kind of intellectual ambition or a scientific ambition that she is very much critiquing. The students will notice that there are many allusions to poetry in the novel. There are actually excerpts of poetry in the novel. And the romantic poets, not to get into the weeds about what romanticism is, but to say that this might be something that students will then go on to be interested in, who knows. Romantic poets were very much interested in these kinds of questions. Mary Shelley's husband, Percy Shelley, went on to write a poem called Prometheus Unbound in 1820. One of the texts that's most important here is the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which the novel quotes and alludes to in a number of ways. And that's the story, poem written by Coleridge, about a man who shoots an albatross on a boat at sea. And there were rather dire consequences as a result of this. And so it's a crime against nature, right? And it's that idea of a crime against nature and what its implications are that I think interests her. And just one final thing about the importance of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is that the mariner is then condemned to telling the story of this crime against nature that he had committed over and over and over again. And so I think one of the other great themes here in the novel is narration, is the telling of a story. There are many storytellers in the novel, and we can talk about that in a minute if we like.
So it's not simply anti-science or anti-enlightenment. It's a critique of overweening ambition. Could we narrow it to that?
Yes, I think overweening ambition and overweening ambition that's kind of excludes the human community. So we remember from the novel that when Victor goes off to study and becomes involved in his project of experimentation and animating life, animating a dead creature to life, that he stops communicating with his family, with his dear friend Henry, with Elizabeth. And so there's a kind of monomania, I think, also that she's critiquing. But yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, I think he says I narrowed myself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if Victor is our zealous overreacher, and certainly he's selfish and he's single-minded, what's Walton's role? Because of course it starts with Walton and then it sort of ends with Walton. He sort of bookends. Is he just another version of Victor? Sorry. They both seem to have a thing for sisters, right? Because
Yeah.
right, Walton's writing to his sister, and Victor's going to marry Elizabeth, who he says is more than a sister. They both are glory seekers. They both certainly want to run roughshod, or willing to, over others. There's a point in which Walton says at the beginning of the novel that he doesn't care what gets in the way. One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirements of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think Walton is a potential Victor Frankenstein. And for all the reasons that you just mentioned. And he is also a bridge between the reader and the story of Victor Frankenstein and the creature that he creates. And that's one of the things about the novel that I think is most difficult in teaching non-literature students, which is the structure. The entire story is told through Walton. It begins explicitly with the letters, but then the story itself, which Victor has told him, is then repeated to his sister in the letters. And of course, embedded in Victor's narrative is the creature's narrative. And even within that, really, there's Safi's story. So you have this, it's like Russian dolls, right? You know, one story embedded within the next. And Walton, therefore, I think students might want to think about why Shelley chose this structure. It's a challenging thing to think about. But one aspect of it that seems to me to be pretty straightforward is that Walton is this person who kind of stands in between, right? He hasn't gone as far as an overreacher as Victor. So he may be a little bit like us as readers. So I think of him as a bridge, right? As the person who can kind of introduce these much more lurid and extreme elements of the story of Victor. But he is a scientist, and he's very much engaged, Walton that is, engaged in discovery. It's a voyage of discovery that he's taking. He's a kind of solitary figure. It's interesting that you mentioned the sisters, because it occurs to me that both Victor and Walton are kind of enclosed, right, in a circle of family, which is a way of saying that, and you know, I might use the word incestuous, I'm not sure, in teaching students, but they are kept within a very small community and have not extended beyond it. So their sense of a kind of wider community is somewhat limited. And here is Walton, who chooses as his interlocutor his sister in this epistolary form. And I think one of the things about Walton, I don't know if we want to talk about it now or later, is to what degree he's a good bridge. Is, you know, how trustworthy is Walton? And I think that comes up at the end of the novel, which we could get to later.
I'm struck by the fact that Walton is also isolated. That it doesn't seem like he has anyone on that ship, his crew, that he can converse with. And that he's got his sister who he's writing to, and then of course Victor comes on board, and he seems to almost fall in love with Victor, the way he describes his voice. He's taken by him, and I was wondering, you didn't use the word twin, and I thought you would. Are they twins?
Walton and Victor. Yeah. Obviously, Walton sees something in Victor that he would like to replicate, and that's part of it. The other part of it is that there's this extraordinary theme of friendship in the novel. So that it's almost as though Walton has said, I think earlier on, that he would love to find a sort of kindred spirit, someone who understands his ambitions, someone who has taken a similar path to the path that he aspires to. And I think that when Walton sees Victor in some way that is, as you kind of suggest, is rather unexplained, right? Or at least not overtly explained, he becomes immediately smitten with him as this friend, right? This person who's going to be the one who understands him. And but you're right in saying that if in fact he's looking for friendship, it's an odd way to look for it, to be in this kind of solitary state on board ship going towards the frozen north. And of course, the real friend, which we might want to talk about in a minute, is Henry Clerval, who knows what true friendship is.
Yes, Henry's my favorite character, in many ways because he is our liberal arts major. It's a shame he has to die, because he has clarity, he sees, and he restores Victor's health, right, through the reading of literature. Do we want to talk a little bit about him as the sort of almost antidote, or what's the word we want to use? Antithesis.
Yeah.
Of the glory seekers.
Yes, he's. I mean, I think that's a good point. He's not only the sort of humanist liberal arts student. He's also a generous and self-effacing man. So he is the antithesis on the egotism scale, right? He's the antithesis. And it's interesting that he studies languages, and the emphasis there being on communication, being able to understand, to communicate. And he even when Victor is in this sort of recovery period, and Henry is helping to sort of tend to him, they study languages together. Henry is also the one who understands most profoundly the sort of corrective and curative powers of nature, right? He takes Victor into these incredible scenes, the mountains. He kind of it's the romantic sublime somehow that comes through Henry, and it acts as this powerful force that will cure Victor from time to time. It's kind of intermittent. He backslides, and then he has another dose of nature. And the same thing happens actually with the creature, who at one stage also benefits from being in these kinds of natural settings. So Henry does very much represent not only the antithesis, but the antidote, right? He is the one who knows how to cure Victor's soul.
So, okay, so we're talking about the more sensitive characters in the novel. So let's turn to the creature. And I'm going to start with the fact that when we first talked about this, you corrected me. I was saying monster, right? and you said, let's call him the creature. And I think that's right, but I also think that students might push back a little, particularly because they may know the movies. And he is formed of, the creature is formed of dead matter. He's hideously ugly. He has yellow skin, and I'm quoting from the novel, scarcely cover his muscles and arteries beneath, watery eyes, a shriveled complexion, and of course, worst of all, black lips. So why shouldn't I call him the monster?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and the problem here is that this creature has no name. That's the first problem. And of course, we know that many people think that the monster or the creature is called Frankenstein. And so Frankenstein has actually become synonymous with the creature rather than with the creature's creator. so that's the first problem. But it's very interesting. How do you talk about a character, and the creature is a character who doesn't have a name? And I think that, I mean, he's called all different things. He's called the creature, he's called a monster, he's called a fiend, he's called a devil. But why I think creature is perhaps the most neutral is that when he is first assembled by Victor takes parts, and I don't have the words in front of me, he has parts that are beautiful and symmetrical, and he puts them together, and he thinks that the proportions will be right. And then the minute the creature comes alive, he looks the way you've just described him. He looks hideous. So it is perhaps one way to interpret this is that no matter how beautiful the parts are, that the act of creating this life out of dead matter itself distorts the figure into a monstrous looking creature. But I also think monstrousness may not be in this text a matter of appearance, but rather a matter of moral content, of the sort of ethical state of a being, and that we're meant to kind of think about this. And there's tremendous emphasis on the creature's ugliness and on the creature's physical appearance. And you'll remember that moment when he is spending time outside the home of the de Lacys, and really they become his family. They're the only family really that he has in the course of the narrative. He learns from them, he adores them, and he has occasion to look at his reflection in a pool. And it's a kind of anti-Narcissus moment, right? Narcissus who looks in a pool and falls in love with himself, which is then of course taken up by Milton in Paradise Lost when he has Eve look at herself in a pool and she thinks she's pretty great looking. Well, here you have the monster looking and understanding that he is hideous. And then of course, soon after that, he decides to approach de Lacy, who is blind, and therefore does not react, is not repelled by the creature initially. But when the rest of the group, the rest of the family see the creature, they react in horror. Felix beats him. And this is the turning point, right? This is the moment when the creature knows that his hideousness will prevent him from having human connection. It's when he becomes full of rage and the desire to take revenge. And then it's also leads to the moment where he says, I need a partner who looks like me. I need someone who looks like me, who's not going to be repelled by the way I look. So I guess to me, monstrousness is an interesting word to think about for students. You know, what makes us think something is monstrous.
So let's then turn to the creation scene. And probably the audience knows that in all of the various Frankenstein films, the creation scene is climactic. You have the lavatory and the gloomy castle, you have the lightning and thunder and the electricity, and then the standard cry, you know, it's alive. But in the novel, that scene is very simple. And I'll just read a couple lines from it. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. It was already 1 a.m. My candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of a half-distinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard. A convulsive motion agitated its limbs. So this scene is really rather quiet. It's muted in comparison to the way it's always done, right? I wonder if it's almost more frightening.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's as though the movies have made this into a Gothic scene, right? And they've taken, you know, the conventions of Gothic and put them in a place where Mary Shelley didn't. I think it is actually more startling. It really stops you in your tracks when you're reading. But I also think that the sort of normal quality of it suggests to me as a reader that it isn't so much that moment of the creation that is the real story here, or the real drama here. It's what happens after that, right? It's the aftermath of the creation. It's the neglect of Victor, by Victor, of his creation. It's the cruelty that the creature encounters. It's the murderousness of the creature. Those are the things that are the real drama here. And the actual, it's a way of saying that the scientific advance that Victor has accomplished here is really not so extraordinary. It's not the thing that we want to dwell on, right, as the real essence of the story.
I like that. I have often thought about that scene, and it's just the moments after it, really, where he is taken back by what he sees and abandons it.
Yes, yes.
So that's kind of a birthing scene, right? in a certain sense. And so let's turn to Mary Shelley and her own experiences with birth and with motherhood, and women more generally in this novel. It seems to me that very few mothers, they seem to be dead already, or in the case of Victor, his mother dies when he's 17, and Elizabeth takes her place. What do we make of that?
Yeah. Well, back in the 20th century, that Andy Delbenco mentioned at the outset, in the 1970s, feminist critics started to think about what this novel meant as a sort of story of birth, of childbirth. And there are two salient things here about Shelley's biography. One is that the woman who gave birth to her, Mary Wollstonecraft, the first great feminist intellectual and writer, really, in England, died soon after giving birth to Mary Shelley, so that she never knew her mother. And the other salient fact here is that Mary Shelley herself, over her lifetime, gave birth to 4 children, only one of whom survived. And which was not unusual in terms of the infant mortality rates of the early 19th century. And of course, that kind of leads one to think about the fact that death and birth were much more closely intertwined, I think, in the consciousness of women of that period than they are for us today. So you have women dying in childbirth at much greater rates, and you have children not surviving. So this relationship between death and birth, I think, is something that, as a woman, Mary Shelley was very familiar with from her own life, as well as just from the culture generally. And so I think that, the missing women, right, the missing mothers, as you point out, may have something to do with her own biography. But I think that there's also a way in which this is a novel about men. This is a novel about a kind of ambition and a kind of aspiration that would have been much commoner in her historical moment in the men around her than it would have been in the women she knew or who surrounded her. So what do we have in the novel? We have a dead mother. We have a cousin's sister wife, Elizabeth, who is killed. We have a servant girl, Justine, who is falsely accused and snuffed out. We have Safi, who in some ways is the most interesting of these characters, who plays a very small part, but she's the Arabian, and she also is the monster creature's fellow student. They kind of learn English together.
Mm-hmm.
But I was thinking that the most consequential missing female in the novel is the creature's partner, right?
Mhm.
This is the big lacuna in the story. There is this partner he wants to be created for him, a female, because he sees by his reading, he sees by what he can encounter in life, that this is the answer for him. I mean, whether it would turn out to be the answer, we never get a chance to find out. But so it seems to me there is a kind of overarching thread. There's a kind of thread here of the missing woman, and the missing woman at the heart of the story is this partner who never is created for the creature.
I mean, I keep thinking that this is also possibly about ambivalence towards motherhood. Having been abandoned by her mother,
Mm-hmm.
right, and losing children, perhaps because of Percy Bysshe's ambitions. He's making her travel all the time with these little children. Two of them die. It seems like she also has a tense relationship in a way with motherhood. And I think you mentioned to me, there's that dream that she has about one of them coming back to life.
Yes. Yeah, the first child, who I think was born in 1815, just before she starts to write Frankenstein, dies, and she writes in her journal, I dreamt that the baby came back to life. We put him by the fire and rubbed him, and he was alive. And then I woke up and it wasn't true. And I was just filled with grief. So I think ambivalence would certainly be a reasonable response to maybe being the one who gives birth and the one who caused the death of her mother. Not so much a reaction against mothers so much as a kind of understanding that it is a vexed role in life, physically as well as psychologically. And I just wanted to add one other thing about women not being in the text, which is, of course, very obvious, which is the other missing woman is the partner who might actually have been the mother of the creature. That is, we have a man who decides to give birth on his own, right, without benefit of a female partner. And after Victor brings the creature to life, he has a dream, rather haunting dream. I'm just going to read it. I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her. But as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms, which it seems to me is a way for Shelley to suggest that having created this creature is a crime against women. It's not just a crime against nature, it's a crime against women. So we know he is going to cause indirectly the death of Elizabeth, which may be prefigured in this dream, but it's also, Elizabeth turns into his mother. So I do think I think that's Shelley's way of suggesting that giving birth without the female is in some sense a rejection of women in a kind of general sense.
I think we want to return back to the creature, and particularly that scene in the Alps, when the creator and the creature meet for the first time. And what, of course, is so amazing is that the creature is so eloquent, right? That he's had an amazing education. And this brings to mind the fact that I've often thought that this was a book about books. And one could almost base a whole semester of transformative text around the creature's reading list. We've got Goethe's Sufferings of Young Werther, Plutarch's Lives, and most importantly, Paradise Lost, which you've already mentioned. And Paradise Lost, of course, is the most powerful. And this is almost a secular retelling of that tale. Um, what do you think about that? And what do you think about, what is she suggesting about the transformative power of these texts?
Yes, the books that he's able to read after he sort of observes the de Lacys are the three, well, Werther, Plutarch's Lives, Paradise Lost, and I think he learns from them what human feelings are, both ecstasy, I think he says, and dejection. Dejection, which is a very important word for the Romantic poets. The feeling of being oppressed, of being what we would call depressed. That's what dejection was. And so he is continually being educated in the novel, and through books, and through observing the de Lacy family, he's able to observe certain kinds of emotions that he otherwise perhaps would not have understood or even experienced. It's interesting that Plutarch is a series of little biographies, their lives. The Sorrows of Young Werther is a kind of autobiography. So here are some narratives of lives that he can consume in order to understand what the trajectory of a life might be, but also it's a way of talking about narrative, right? It's a way of talking about the narrative of a life, of thinking about how the narrative of a life is so powerful. For us as readers, and I think for students as readers. And I think that the Paradise Lost, which is this extraordinary, it's the story of human origins, right? It's the great English epic. So, and origins are obviously a great theme in this novel. But it also gives Victor archetypes, right? So he thinks to himself, I ought to be Adam, right? I ought to be an Adam, but instead I think I am a Satan. And this notion of being satanic is something that is important to both Victor and to the creature. But it also introduces this question of being isolated and alone. Because at first, of course, Adam is alone, but then a partner is created for him. And I think the creature talks about this. Satan is always isolated. He never has a partner. And I think the creature kind of extrapolates from this, that this is something that perpetuates evil. There is no Eve to soothe his sorrows, is the way he thinks about it in the novel. And just to touch a little bit on this idea of Victor also being a kind of satanic figure, one of the things that seems powerful to me now, although it didn't always about the novel, is the way in which Victor and the creature mirror each other. And in the way that, as you mentioned, the creature becomes more eloquent, he becomes more knowledgeable, he becomes more learned. In the same way, Victor becomes more enraged, more focused on taking revenge. By the time he arrives on Walton's boat, he's kind of a madman. He's kind of crazed. So they've each acquired the qualities of the other in a certain way. The language of rage and revenge is first associated with the creature, and then it kind of is transmuted to Victor, who particularly after Elizabeth is murdered. Those become the words that are associated with him: rage, and revenge. There's also an interesting kind of rhetoric in the novel about slavery. After the creature kills Elizabeth, I think that's where it is. No, it's after Victor decides not to continue to create the female partner and just destroys it. The creature is at his most aggrieved and distraught and says, "Slave," he says to Victor, "remember that I have power. You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey." so that he feels that there's been a kind of changing of places there, because he has so much anger. He's so intent on taking violent revenge that gives him a kind of power. So at that point, the creature feels that perhaps he is the master and Victor is a slave. And then at the very end, after Victor's death, the creature says the contrary. He says, I was the slave, not the master of an impulse. And I think there you're meant to sort of think about when those who subjugate others themselves become subjugated, but also just in terms of the emotions. When do emotions become our subjugators? When do the things that consume us emotionally and psychologically become our masters? But I think this language of slavery, coupled with the emphasis on physical difference in the novel, is something that can be used to think about the novel in a very contemporary way.
No, I would agree with that completely. And it goes to the, it's a simple question, but, where should our sympathies lie? And when it comes to the creature, he is in a way the most human, strange enough. And particularly at the end, when he's hovering over the lifeless body of Victor, and he says, I forgive you.
Yes.
Right. So he's the one who forgives, self-serving, his self-serving master.